we do have to go and look a bit further east and talk about the Super League, where José Mourinho, of course, never far from the headlines, has found another way of interacting with the television cameras. Andy, do you mind just explaining what went on? He took his laptop and he showed us, the viewer, what was going on his laptop. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I feel, Dotton, that I owe José Mourinho a little bit of an apology, because we've talked in the recent past, on the continent about how Carlo Ancelotti's this coaching chameleon who looks at what he's done in every job and goes on and tries to improve the process, does things differently, isn't wedded to any sort of tactics. And Mourinho's always accused of playing the hits. I've never seen him do this before. And he's in his 60s now. So I think what happened is that they're playing away at Antalyaspor at the weekend. Antalyaspor, by the way, their head coach is Alex de Souza, who is arguably the most famous player in the history of Fenerbahçe. There's a golden statue of him in Kadıköy outside the Şükrü Saracoğlu stadium. And so you think, this is Alex coming back together with Fenerbahçe. Mourinho can't possibly make this about him. Oh, yes, he can. Now, there's an Edin Dzeko goal that is disallowed, and he gets his laptop. I don't want to say like a man in his 60s showing you a YouTube clip in the pub, but you have this little sort of cushioned area around the main broadcast camera, and that's like standard practice in football stadiums. And so he gets his laptop with what he says is a bit of footage that proves Dzeko is onside. It doesn't, by the way, because he's not. And he props it on there. And yeah, I mean, it's not just that he wants to show it to the fourth official. He wants to show it to us, the viewer. Now, I guess you could ask, how is this relevant in a Turkish Super League situation? Now, it's because what Mourinho does that we kind of go, oh, well, it's just Jose, isn't it? It finds its place, for better or worse, in the Super League. Because if we go back a couple of years, Fenerbahçe actually accused being the rights holder of incorrectly drawing the offside lines to disadvantage them. I mean, being never drew the offside lines, by the way. That was the TFF, that was the federation. But of course, once that exaggeration or mistruth is out there, what do they say? The lies twice around the world before the truth's got its trousers on. And, you know, Mourinho is in fighting the corner of his team, his club, which is something that he did very successfully at Roma, of course, and, you know, created this cult of Mourinho all over again. He's found a place there already, almost independent of results.
As Andy's alluded to, Mourinho is in his swinging 60s. He comes out fighting wherever he is. What do you feel about in comparison to when he was in Italy, is he swinging the same way?
It's a funny question. I was looking back over some things from his first game in charge against Lugano, and he was talking about their manager there, Mattia Crocitorti, and saying he complains too much and called it the emotion of youth. And I wonder if this laptop is some wisdom of age to keep coming up with new ways to complain rather than different ones. It's not new to say this. Jose is someone who can be quite a lot of a hypocrite and says things that very obviously aren't true. And in the game against, after the loss against Galatasaray the other day, didn't do his press conference and said he'd been made to wait 70 minutes. And I believe he said that he'd never refused to speak to the press before, which is a provable lie. Obviously, he was in Silenzio Stampa, press silence quite often in Italy. So he says all sorts of things that aren't true, and he's always good at creating his own narrative. And it's always been the case for Jose that his narrative will hold with a certain number of people. And the question for Jose is always, will his narrative hold with the most important people, which is his current employers? And I think perhaps as important, his current fan base, and are they buying the story? Because really at Fenerbahçe, beating Galatasaray is it. They were very good last season. They would have set a points record if it wasn't for Galatasaray going even higher. So the bar is beat Galatasaray, and they didn't do that in their first chance to do it. They lost, and so he's up against it already. And I think when Jose is most up against it is very often the moment when we see his most creative forms of distraction, and a laptop in front of the camera is a very creative form of distraction.
You know, when we're getting into the truth weeds here, I've just got an image of Mourinho sitting on that little thing that he propped the laptop on, like for the next game, with a sort of red cap saying "Make Fenerbahçe great again." The next step, surely.
That's MEFA.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you heard it here first. Make sure you go and get your red baseball caps. But Fenerbahçe have got a real problem. If the main goal is to beat Galatasaray by any means possible, Galatasaray have brought in reinforcements this season that might prove that more difficult than Jose Mourinho had imagined.
Yeah, Victor Osimhen obviously was the big transfer saga of the summer, not going to one of the big Premier League clubs like a lot of people expected, or PSG as some also expected, but instead ending up on this loan deal at Galatasaray, and hits the ground running, scores some goals, and now perhaps is out. I've seen reports today for as long as 6 weeks. So his story is still a bit of an ambiguous one, but certainly first game together, starting up front with Mauro Icardi, they both scored. They had 3 between them. It looks like a partnership that could work, although the team did not look especially balanced. Perhaps it doesn't matter if you can score that many goals. Certainly the Osimhen Icardi partnership seems to be something the players are enjoying, because Osimhen described Icardi as like a big brother, which led my mind to all sorts of questions about whether that's a good dynamic. But as I understand it, he could be out for as much as a month and a half now, so we'll see.
Which is obviously not a good thing in itself, but I wonder if it does Okan Buruk, the coach of Galatasaray, almost a little bit of a favour, because you looked at this game against Kazim Pasha, where they first started together, and as Nicky says, so entertaining, so enjoyable. I'm not surprised they enjoyed it as well. So 2 for Osimhen, the 2 brilliant finishes, very different but very brilliant finishes, and then Icardi saying, actually, you know, hold my mate, here's a finish, and then he spanks one into the top corner. They're 3-0 up, and then from improbably they give it away. They've got a 100% record before this, and they end up conceding a late equaliser and drawing 3-3, which they definitely shouldn't be doing at home to Kazim Pasha. And you look at the team that's on the pitch, and the nearest they've got to a defensive midfielder is Kerim Demirbay. And apart from that, you know, it's all a very, very unprotected defence. You know that you're not going to get an enormous amount of press from that front 2. You know you're not going to do anything in Europe with that front 2. I just don't believe that's possible to win top level European games with those 2 up front, amazing as they are. So does this just become a sort of bit of a luxury circus trick, really, where you can play these 2 up front against the weaker teams, which is obviously what they tried to do, because Kazim Pasha are not one of the best teams in the league, and they still end up making up a 3-0 deficit, which shouldn't be possible. Now, look, I'm not pinning it all on those 2 players, but you look at the change in formation, and you would say Galatasaray could probably do with a number 6 anyway, and they're maybe lacking in balance in the squad because they've pursued names at various points. But really, when I was saying it's maybe doing Okan Buruk a little bit of a favour, when everyone's fit, he has to start Osimhen and Icardi. He just can't not. You know, he can't leave one of those on the bench. But whereas if one of them's got a fitness issue, he's got the reason he needs to just start one of them, which I think probably lends a better balance to the team.
Okay, in terms of European football, at least, Nicky, do the Turkish teams, Galatasaray and Fenerbahçe, do they fit into a credible Europa League contenders, at least?
Well, I think this is one area where Jose Mourinho has made himself quite an interesting challenge, because actually after they were knocked out of Champions League qualifying by Lille, he presented it as this could almost be a good thing. He said, obviously, it's a shame to miss out on the big Champions League nights, and the club would earn more money from the Champions League, but realistically, we're not a club that can compete to win the Champions League. The clear implication being we are a club that can compete to win the Europa League. If he's saying that, if he's saying there's an advantage to going into the Europa League, it's that actually, well, this is a competition that's more our level. Now you have to prove that you are indeed at the level to do that. And I think in some ways that makes total sense, because as we've just been talking about, domestically, the challenge is so specific. You have to beat Galatasaray to make it a success. That's almost too much pressure. And we saw at Roma how perhaps it wasn't always the domestic success that the club had hoped for, but he made up for that by winning the Europa Conference League and then going to the final of the Europa League. That was enough to keep the ownership happy, to keep the fans happy. You can certainly see him looking at this competition and seeing it in the same light. But that's a big question for me of whether or not Fenerbahçe are actually good enough, because there's some pretty good teams in the Europa League too.
I just wonder, Nikki, if you're talking about being the best Turkish team, not just in the Europa League, but domestically as well. I'm wondering if this is a good season to be Besiktas, because they have had a very good start to the season, which started with them beating Galatasaray 5-0 in the Super Cup, of course. Giovanni van Bronckhorst is in charge there, and he's managed things pretty well so far. I think there's so much noise around Galatasaray and Fenerbahçe for the Osimhen reasons and for the Mourinho reasons and from the title race they had last season. Besiktas have clearly already improved a lot. They've had a really good transfer window. They've got a coach who seems on it, even though Van Bronckhorst had varied results in his previous jobs. And in terms of sort of being able to pick the most practical team, I think that Mourinho and Buruk have got challenges in that, because we talked about Galatasaray getting that balance between attack and defence. I think if you look at the front three that Fenerbahçe are going to want to start most games with, Dzeko, Tadic, St. Maximin, that gives you nothing off the ball. Like you've no chance of going deep in the Europa League with that, in my opinion. Whereas I just wonder, Nikki, and talking of players who've thrived in Serie A and then go on to do really well in the Super League, I just wonder if that balance that Besiktas have, before we even talk about the rest of the team, they've got very, very good midfield. But if you look at having Ciro Immobile up front, who started this season brilliantly, and it feels like this move is exactly what he needs at this point in his career. And then you have a very, very pacey playmaker who can almost morph into a second striker behind him in Rafa. That to me feels like a team that is well set to do well in the Super League, but also has like a more practical use against superior opposition on paper in the Europa League.
They took a bit of a thumping, didn't they, from Ajax in the Europa League? So I'm not sure if it's a good time
Fair to say.
making that case. They lost 4-0. Look, Immobile has always been one of those strikers who I think does his best work when a team is built to his very specific strengths. That's what Simone Inzaghi did so well at Lazio, was turning them into this fast break team that allowed him to make sure that Immobile is playing with his face to goal, getting those balls in front of him, trying to get on the shoulder of the defenders. And it seems like it's those lessons have not gone unlearned, let's say, at Besiktas, and that certainly can be a great formula for him. He is 34 years old, so I have some questions about whether or not that lasts at the highest level for the full season, and whether or not he can do it in those biggest games in the Europa League. But I've got a soft spot for Chilo, so I certainly hope it goes well for him.